Welcome back to the series. We are talking about the healing of the life by walking with Jesus Christ and how that goes. What we want to understand the reality of it. And my hope is that as we go along, you will increasingly slip into that reality and that you will find the power of Christ's presence with you in everything that you do. That's the intent, you know. And when we try to live it on our own, we make a mess of it. And we weren't made to be like that. We're going to talk about that a bit tonight. Tonight we want to talk about the body and about our social relationships. And we've talked a good deal about the placing the mind, and then last week the feelings. And because of the possibility of misunderstanding, we always need to add that we don't go this alone, that what we do in these areas is always a work of grace. And I want to just state what grace is. Grace is God acting in our lives. That's grace. It's God acting in our lives. Now you may think, well, but it's unmerited favor. It's unmerited favor. But if that's all you say, you don't know what it is. Practically, it's God acting in our lives. And then we've talked about our mind and the need to fill our mind with God and to bring ourselves into the place of worship. I so appreciate Sally's leading that song, "Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down." See, we can live there. That's what we're talking about. We can live there. And it won't diminish our capacities to drive our car or to do other. Actually, we'll do better. And if we just learn to live with that attitude of worship, then these parts here that we have looked at and want to hold it before you is we work through all of these areas, because it is by working through these areas with grace, learning how to keep God present in our minds, experiencing the reality and the feelings of love and joy and peace and hope and faith. That's what transforms us inwardly. So then, in a way that we need to understand is just really easy, worship becomes natural. See, the mind and the feelings are focused on the greatness of God. And that's where we learn to live, is in the greatness of God. And then the teaching that I'm with you always, the Lord is my helper, I shall not fear what man will do unto me if they come and cut my throat. That's, see, you have to go all the way here and turn it loose. You can't keep hanging on. You have to turn it loose. See, we believe that God will be constantly with this pastor and his children, and that the lady who was murdered is far better off now than she's ever been before. And that's the kind of thing, you know, you just sort of have to stop and gasp a bit before you say it, because we're not brought up in that world. You know, we're not formed in that world. Worship is the intense focusing of a surrendered will with the mind and feelings on the greatness of God. See that center part there. And now next time I want to talk about the soul and the will together, because people have a hard time understanding that. And so we'll come back to that. But the center here, you see, that's what. Now we're going to move out, because the body and the social realm is where we actually live. See, and we want to take that worship there. In the midst of worship, we stand secure against sin and evil. That place where we stand in worship is the most powerful discipline of all in the moment. You cannot be in rebellion against God, or you cannot allow yourself to go against God when you stand in His presence. See? And you can even say that when we are able to do that, it's always because we have turned to something less. And our feelings and our mind are responding to something less. I love these words from the book of Revelation. Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing, and every created thing which is in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all things in them. I heard saying, to Him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing, honor, glory, and dominion forever and ever. See? Now that's worship. And when you stand there, all evil is defeated in your life. Tozer uses the words to describe worship: astonished reverence, admiration to the point of wonder and delight. You know, that's really what we've been talking about here, thus far. Now, we can learn to live there. And just to touch once more on last week's lesson, you remember Paul saying, I've learned to be content no matter what? Guess how you do that? Learning to live with your mind full of God. And that is something that God makes available to us. We can actually do that. Just a little story of how that works. It's a true story. It's about a nurse. And nurses have to take care of people when they are in pretty bad shape. They're not attractive. And this nurse was known in the hospital where she worked for being able to lovingly and joyfully care for people who, from a human point of view, were just very repulsive in the way they looked and what they were suffering. And that happens. And I worked as an orderly, or whatever you call it, in a hospital when I was in college for a while. And it was actually very good for me. And this nurse was known for her ability to joyfully take care of people and bless them. And they said to her, how do you do it? And now she said something very simple, but it's about the mind and the feeling. She said, when I look at someone like this and I'm caring for them, I always remember that they were somebody's baby. Now see, that was a choice on her part. That's what I'm illustrating. She had learned how to do that. Now that's not exactly the same as worship, but she had a view of life that allowed her to do that. You see, you have to have a larger view of life if you're going to do that kind of thing. Mother Teresa of Calcutta always required of her sisters that they be able to smile. And that goes very deep, you see. Very deep. And if you're going to bring hope to people, it's hard to do it like sad sack, you know. I mean, you need to have joy. And that is possible. Right? So I hope we're up to that now, and the psalmist, I want to give you a few passages from the psalm. We can't work through them all tonight, but this is a wonderful statement. Whom have I in heaven but thee? And besides thee I desire nothing on earth. My heart, my flesh and my heart may fail. I can't even rely on myself. Now remember, the flesh are the natural human abilities. It isn't bad in itself. We got to talk about that more tonight. But it's your natural human abilities. Your heart, the very center of your will may fail. But God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. That word portion is used a great deal in Scripture. I give you some other passages here to look at. They're on your sheet, and I'd encourage you to use them in meditation. But to say the Lord is my portion is just to say the Lord is what I've got. That's what that means. The Lord is my portion. The Lord is what I've got. And thinking that through and learning to live out of that, you see, is what enables us to go on. But now tonight we want to look at the body and our relationship to others. And in our life, these always go together. The body is essentially social in a human being, and social relations are essentially bodily. I can't just say I'm going to relate to you spiritually, because it is what is in my body that will come out in that relationship. And if it's not in my body, I ain't got it yet. Right? And so it's not easy to talk about this because we're not used to dealing with this, but we just have to understand the centrality of the body to redemption. And the body is the primary instrument of evangelization, for example. It's what I bring in my body. And often you have people who, what they bring in their body contradicts what they say. And we have this phrase, body language. It's very deep, the idea of body language. The idea of the body as speaking. My eyebrows, my shoulders, the way I turn, the way I walk, are all expressions of who I am. Of who I am. And the interesting thing here is, of course, that you can't fake body language. You can't do it. If you try to, it turns out not to be body language. It turns out to be a project of some sort. Because our body really speaks. And then also in our social relationships, we have to recognize that the real relationships are more open than we dare imagine sometimes. And we do read one another pretty thoroughly and pretty well. And that's built into the need we have to really know one another. And unfortunately, the sad state of many of our personal relationships and the way we interact with people, see, that's a reflection of who we really are. So here we have to change, way down deep. And just to see how we're doing with this, let me read you a couple of passages here and ask you a question. 1 Peter 2, therefore putting aside all malice and all guile and hypocrisy and envy and all slander, like newborn babies, long for the pure milk of the Word. Here's another passage from Ephesians. Wonderful Ephesians 4. And here Paul says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other just as God in Christ has forgiven you. Now, here's the question, and this is just to kind of check us out and make sure we're on track here with what is the mistake I'm most likely to make when I hear that? Just think about it a moment. What is the mistake that I am most likely to make? Then think about what we've covered now thus far in the series when I hear that. Say that again, please. Well, that's right. And even just doing those things. Just doing those things. And Mary, it's much worse if we try it on our own. I see. This is an old friend of mine, a young friend of mine, Mary Knapp. I taught her how to drive. She almost killed us. But that's it, you see. Okay, I'm going to lay aside malice. Now, malice is just the intent to harm. That's all it is. Malice is the intent. Oh, I'm going to lay aside malice. You see, the mistake there is focusing on the action. Now, sometimes we have to take action with reference to actions and do something about them, but that's never the solution. The solution is, for me, not to be a malicious person. See, I want to become the kind of person for whom malice would be unnatural. Mention slander. See, the same thing. Or a weakened version of slander is gossip. See, so now I want to go through the process. Now here's what's apt to happen in that process, and this is where the body comes in. This world that we come into as children is already moving and flowing in the wrong direction. And we are picked up in it. Now, that is not in itself a bad idea. That's God's plan that it should be like that. It's just that when evil inhabits that world, then I pick that stuff up just by being there, and it becomes something I am ready to do without thinking. Now, think a little bit about our body, and think about what it is. And I don't want to get too philosophical here, but you have to understand that body is potential energy. That's what it is. It's potential energy. And that's true of every body. And if you are into physics, you can explore that in greater depth. But your body is potential energy for your action. Think of it like this. Your body is your little power pack. Your little energizer thing. And what distinguishes it from other bodies is that it is immediately available for you to act from. And that's the center of your kingdom or queendom. Right? That's the center. That's where you start from. And that's a good thing again. See? And the body is made for the Lord, not for you. And I know that it's not popular to say, but you don't own your body. You're not the Lord of your body. Your body was made to be inhabited by God. And that actually is the only way it will work. And it needs to live in a world where there are others inhabited by God as well. So this talk about being a temple, you see, that you want to take that very literally, and if you do, then you'll begin to experience your body in a different way. unfortunately, it's degraded by sin. And when we look at this passage in Romans 1, 26 and 27, you see the outcome of that. When we turn away from God, we invariably turn to our body. And that's why sex and violence run so deep in human culture. See, those are fundamentally bodily things. And Romans 1 is a story about the development of sensuality in world history. And it isn't like it's just one story, because it happens over and over and over again. It happens also to individuals. Sensuality is incredibly destructive. And when you give into it and you say, you can rule my life, then you are on a ground where you can't win, because sensuality is unlimited. And so you just push it more and more and more and more. And it isn't self-limiting. And if you give into it, you will be addicted to it. And in fact, the addict is a person who has surrendered their will to feelings. They have said to their feelings, you may rule me. Now, I know there are a lot of subtleties about all of this, but that's how addiction works. That's why, for example, you'll find some people who can go cold turkey off of heroin. And then you find others that are defeated by coffee or Twinkies or something like that, you know. Because that person who can do that is one who stands and says, I will not relent to my feelings. Let them come as strong as they will. I will not. And now, those are the colorful cases, but you see feelings come in many forms. We talked about many of them last time, and we always have to take that stand, you see, because away from God, our body is degraded by giving in to its feelings. And many times that happens because we don't take good care of our bodies and respect them and put them to their proper use, which is to serve the Lord. So a large part of what it means for us to be dead in trespasses and sin is to be enslaved to our bodies. And I'm hoping that you can just sort of think about the general cultural situation and see how people respond to their bodies and try to manage it and manipulate it. I mean, all the way from power dressing. You know about power dressing? Well, that's a very real thing. It's very interesting. I watch it all the time. In the circles that I go in, people who they come with their power suits because there's going to be a meeting, and they don't want to be down in the pecking order because they're not dressed with their power suits. And I see ladies and men both. They're caught in that same sort of thing. I'm not necessarily saying it's wrong, but I hope you've got more to trust than your power dressing. But that's just an illustration. You see, we put the body up front and and use it to ways to get our way, and that degrades it in sin. Now, if you have time to meditate on these passages, it'll help a lot before it kind of grows dim in your mind. But read Romans 1 all the way through and watch how that works. Now, the quickening that comes when we turn our will to God and are born again, see, that reaches to our body also. And in this passage I do want to read to you because I want you to have hope about it, and I'm going to do a good bit with it tonight anyway. So here's Romans 8. However, it says, Romans 8, verse 8 and following, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Now, Does that mean you ought to commit suicide to please God? No. To be in the flesh means to live in terms of the body. That's what it means, to live in terms of the body. And if you're living in terms of the body, you can't please God because you haven't put Him in the right place in your life. Okay? Now watch. However, you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. But if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he does not belong to Him. And if Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, yet the Spirit is alive because of righteousness. Okay, so now you've got a new force other than your natural bodily abilities and energies. And those are working. You have a new force. And if the Spirit of Him that raised up Jesus from the dead dwells in you, He who raised Jesus Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. To your mortal bodies. It'll be something that you will know because your body is different. And the potential energy that becomes available to you is not just the natural abilities of your body, but now there is a power at work in you to quicken that body. Quicken means to give it life. There's a financial program called Quicken. You have it on your... That's not it, you know. So, quicken means to add a new life. And life is a kind of an activity that is self-sustaining, self-directing, self-initiating. So now there's something moving in you, and it moves your body. Your body becomes different as you're indwelt as the temple of God. Now the body, in its role as your power pack, is something that God created. It's an arrangement that He's made, and He set it up in such a way that as you live, your character and your experience becomes a part of your body. And simple cases of that are things like learning to write. Do you remember when you were learning to write your letters in school? You remember how hard it was? And you would just, you know. And then after a while, you didn't even think about it. See? And that's the wonder of being an embodied being as God created you, is that you don't have to think about everything you do. Now, that's good when it's good, and it's bad when it's bad, right? Because, and this is a major part of our difficulty, when our character and experience is not good, then evil acts automatically in our bodies and our bodies together in society. And so this is the condition that we have to deal with, and that's why so much of human life seems like it's out of control. It is. And indeed, human government is normally impossible to any great extent, just because of the evil that is present in human life. And that's what Paul means when he says the body is dead because of sin, as I just read it. The body is dead because it's cut off from the only life that would enable the body to actually work as it should. So now note the difference between sin and sins. Sin dwells in our body and in the automatic tendencies of the social setting. You ever wind up walking into a situation where people are and it's like stepping into a rapid stream and it's going in somewhere you don't want to go. And you may be swept away by it. And you may come out of that situation feeling like you've had your head stuck in the toilet or something, you know. You know, that's right, isn't it? Because our body is cued to the things that other people are doing and saying, their body language and all of that, and it just seems like you're being swept along. See, that's the normal course of things. And when anger and wrath and all of these things get going, then people just go crazy. And it's not just that we are wrong, we are wrung. Right? The first night, if you remember, this mic didn't work. And we found out afterwards that something back here had been unhooked. And so we had to use that mic. Well, that's fine. But you see, that's the way we are in our bodies and in our social situations. There's certain connections that are not there. And there are other connections that are there and shouldn't be there. Okay. And as a result of that, then what comes out in action comes out before we think about it. Now that's a serious problem, folks. As we used to say, I don't think they say it anymore, but we used to say we're overdriving our headlights. You know what that means? That means that you're driving so fast that you can't see where you would be by the time you could stop. And we're constantly doing that in life. And that's in our bodies, that's in our social situations, and far beyond what any of our unredeemed character and intentions can mention. Now, we need to look at Romans 7 here, because this is something that really causes people a lot of trouble. And in Romans 7, in the passage that's indicated here, 15 and following, Paul is talking about the conflict that was going on in him when he was unredeemed. Now, that's a big step to say that, because there are many people today, many devout Christians, who say you never get out of Romans 7. That that's where you live until you die. The way you get out of Romans 7 is through the funeral home. And I don't think for a moment that Paul is saying that, but Paul is describing a very real experience. Listen to his language here. Verse 15, that which I am doing I don't understand, for I am not practicing what I would like to do, but I am doing the very thing I hate. Now, that is a common situation for people who have not learned how to be, for example, I've done that. Get in a family quarrel. Your kids irritate you or something, and pretty soon you're saying things that you hate. You don't hate them when you say them. You kind of like them when you say them. But that's the problem, you see. And it has all kinds of forms. It need not just be with sin. It can be with all sorts of things, like maybe spending more on something than you intended to. All kinds of dimensions of doing the thing that I intended not to do. The old version, the things I would that I do not, and the things I would not that I do. Right? Now why was that happening? What made Paul behave in that way? Well, he says, verse 17, no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which indwells me. And if we don't get anything else done tonight, I really would like for us to go away understanding that. What is this sin which indwells me? Well, it isn't your body in the sense of just your body. It isn't your flesh as a natural thing that God has created. Not talking about that. Among other things, it's not talking about sexual desire. See, this is often all thrown over in that bucket. And we have really problems with that. And that's why, for example, the language for sexual union, which I will not repeat, but you know, we use it as a term of degradation. I mean, it's a terrible thing that Satan and history and choice has done to this. It's not talking about that. It's not talking about loving food. Not even talking about loving a good nap or, you know, those things. Good clothes. Not talking about that. See, we get this so messed up. It's like misunderstanding the cross. Peter Cartwright, an old Methodist preacher of years ago, preached on taking your cross and following the Lord. And after that, he was writing to his next engagement and saw one of the people that was in the meeting, not a large man, carrying his wife, who was large, on his back. See, the cross is not stuff you don't like, right? And the sin that is in Paul's members are not his desires. It's rather the habits that his body has taken on so that it runs on its own. And that's why he says, and he's not ducking the charge when he says it, he says, it's not me. It's not me. It's sin that dwells in me. And I'll tell you, folks, that is one of the most important verses to understand when you're dealing with problems of doing what you don't want to do. You have to have your identity to stand somewhere else and say, that is not me. And if you don't have that, it will probably beat you completely to death. The young people struggling with sexual temptation and so on often are defeated by they can't get out of the picture, this is really me, and I'm disgusted with this, and I hate myself. No, you have to stand where Paul stood and say, this is not me. I have a different identity. And when you do that, then you can begin to escape from the law of sin which is in my members. The law of sin there just means the regularity. You wouldn't go wrong to translate it in that passage, the habit. You see, that's what resides in the body are the habits. And they outrun our intentions. Then deliverance comes through the Spirit that comes to live in our bodies. And we identify with that. And you say, well, aren't I just being evasive? No. That's where grace comes in, you see. That's grace enables you to say, I have a life that's different than this. And I can stand in that life. And Paul does not live in Romans 7. He lives in Romans 8. There is therefore no condemnation to them that are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made me free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, and that it was weak through the flesh, God did. And that God did. What a wonderful statement. That's where we have to live. God did. That the righteousness of the law should be fulfilled in we who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. That's in terms of is better. In terms of is better. And then he goes on the wonderful contrast between the mind of the flesh and the mind of the Spirit. And see, that was Paul's understanding. Another passage from Galatians 6 where he's talking about they that sow to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap everlasting life. Now, he's not talking about going to heaven when you die. That'll take care of itself. He's talking about the kind of life that is in God will increasingly come back as you sow to it and count on it. If you sow to the flesh, nothing will come of it good. Live in terms of the flesh is what he's talking about. Now, one of the most instructive things that we can learn about growing and healing brokenness is in this case of Jesus teaching Peter and the other disciples before his death. And you remember that he said, I'm going to be killed. And he said, one of you is going to betray me. And they all just went into paroxysms of denial. And no, we're not. We'll die with you, and so on. And they meant it. They meant it. Give them that, okay? Right. That's what Jesus meant in the garden when he said to his three closest friends, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Remember that? Now that's diagnostic. He's not scolding them. You know, he's not saying if you had the sense God gave a goose, you'd stay awake. He's not scolding them. He's teaching. He's teaching. And that teaching began back with Peter and the others in the upper room. And Peter said, I will die for you. And Jesus looked right at him and said, you know, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. Well, of course, Peter said he denied that. But you see, Jesus knew. And Jesus knew that sin is deeper than sins. And it is not sin, it is sin, not sins, that must be dealt with in healing of the broken life by walking with Jesus. Okay? And sin is that condition of readiness of the socialized, embodied person to do what is wrong. And you can't overcome it by intentions. You have to receive redemption into the body and into the social relations at a much deeper level if you're going to overcome it at all. Now, is that okay? Do you understand what I'm saying there? And just think of Peter. See, put it like this. Peter didn't have to think about it to deny. Right? I mean, when the little girl said, you're one, he didn't have to say, now what shall I do? It just went like that. And he wasn't in a position to think about not denying. If he had been, I mean, he had real problems with this, you know. Because, I mean, you would have think the second time around, he would have experienced a little, haven't I been here before, sort of feeling, you know. But he didn't. Now, why didn't he? Well, again, because the social situation in his body. Now, please think about this, because this is the way to deliverance. It is the inner change that results in someone being aware, knowing what's going on, without having to think a lot about it, and being prepared to do what is right automatically. So I'm afraid you may not have heard that sort of thing before, so I'm just going to say it again. Okay. What we're talking about here is the transformation of the person internally so that they are prepared to do what is right automatically, whatever the social situation is and whatever their condition, their body is ready to go in.